Does anybody know what the technical name of this class is in a college catalog? U.S. history, what? Nope. What is this class actually called in the catalog? Wait, what did you say, Margarita? Oh God, if it was an introduction to the Civil War, yeah, through the Civil War. U.S. history through the Civil War, which doesn't that technically mean if the Civil War is over, the class should be over, right? Didn't we cover everything that the catalog says I'm supposed to cover? Why am I still going? What the hell is this whole chapter 15 about? Reconstruction. Yeah. What came after, right? Why not end at the end of chapter 14? War is over, the South is beat, Lincoln was assassinated, the hero assassinated at his time of victory. Why keep going? Who didn't know what to do?
After the slaves are free, what do we do now?
Well, that's somebody else's business. But why do you think it's important to go a little bit past the Civil War? Like, doesn't everything seem perfect? Slaves are freed. Yeah. The South is defeated. The hero Lincoln is assassinated. It's a brand new era. Why keep going, Stephen? Sorry?
They left a lot of unresolved issues.
Like what?
Rebuilding the South.
You mean like how to rebuild the South? Okay.
How to improve the life of slaves?
Hang on, had a hand up. Go ahead.
It was worth it, the fight.
Yeah. What else? What happened to the slaves now that they're, no longer slaves? What happened to them? Right? Yeah? Okay, what happens now that these slaves are free men and given the vote in many cases, right? Somebody in the back as well? And a hand? Zeleny?
That it was the outcome of what happened. They really followed what they wanted. Let's say, for instance, when they said if they wanted the right to vote, are they actually voting? Are they getting their right because they're voting?
Yeah, go ahead.
Freedom was some of them see freedom in different forms. The definition of freedom was classified far more inclusive of freedom and acquiring land and all that stuff. While the free slave, so
there's a lot of definitions of freedom now that freedom came to America, right? And what does that mean in real life?
So basically, like, everything has to come together and see what happens.
I think these are all good answers and unexpected answers for that matter. But here's the issue that I have. If I were to end this class with chapter 14, where everybody is hunky-dory, the fight's over, slavery's abolished, la 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 la. At some point, I think a student may ask, well, if everything was so good that, why did we need a civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s? Like, if the Civil War solved everything, then how come blacks have to mobilize again 90 years later just to get the vote, to be able to ride buses, wherever they wanted, to go to school wherever they wanted, to sit wherever they wanted in public facilities? Why do we need the Civil Rights era 90 years later if the Civil War supposedly ended the biggest racial problem that America had had since its founding? And the answer is, it didn't end anything. It abolished slavery, but didn't abolish racism. And the North was as racist as the South, except the North came around to the idea that if you want to win this thing, you have to free the slaves, train them, put them in uniform, and use them to put the Union back together. Now, as you did from your readings, there was a section that talked about the legacy of black soldiers, meaning once these men are told to fight just like white Americans who defend America on the principle of union and liberty, they're going to feel entitled to be treated like citizens at the end of this war, which means the vote. And of course it means being treated equally in the eyes of the law. During the war, nobody really had this conversation because nobody wanted to have the conversation. They wanted to win the war first. But then after the war, when blacks in the South could travel anywhere they wanted, could work anywhere they wanted, the decision couldn't be avoided anymore. What does freedom actually mean for these Southern blacks? Some folks said, well, we abolished slavery. What more do you want us to do? You know, that's liberty. That's freedom. No more slavery. 13th Amendment. Other folks said, yes, but you're freeing people that have no money, no education, and no skills. You're condemning them to a life of poverty for generations. How is that freedom? We should do something. And so the fighting began. And it went in waves. A conservative period where, do nothing, just free the slaves, leave it at that. And then a much more radical phase that attempted to bring a semblance of racial equality to the South, which was a complete failure. And the reaction against that, the reaction against the attempt at enforcing racial equality was so severe in the South at a time when Northerners had lost their patience with defending Southern black political and civil rights, that Northerners just said, enough already. Our primary goal is union. We've won the war. We need Southerners to stop being so resistant to, or so always in an uproar. So, the hell with blacks in the South. And what emerges in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s is a system called Jim Crow, where even though the Constitution, especially after the 14th Amendment, says anyone born in this country, regardless of race, is a citizen and must be treated equally in the eyes of the law, that is what the national government law says. In the South, the states, one by one, started passing state laws that completely eliminated Southern civil rights and political rights for blacks, where they could vote, where they could travel to, work. It was this system of Jim Crow which was fought against by the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Black Panther Party, Angela Davis. All of these heroes of the civil rights movement were required because the Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't end racism. The civil rights movement didn't end racism, it just made it a lot harder to put it into practice. Although I can understand after the last few weeks of incessant shootings of young black men in unarmed black men, it is easy to believe that there is way more work that still needs to be done. So, in chapter 15, I want to talk about what you all said. What do we do now that the war is over? Edward brings up the point of freedom. What does it mean? There's all these people involved, blacks, northern whites, southern whites. They all want something different in this new world order. What is the result of this fight? And then next I want to talk about the first phase of Reconstruction, putting the country back together, the first 2 years when Congress wasn't really part of the process, but the president, the guy that took over from Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, he tried to rebuild the country in a very conservative, let's not change anything except for, we abolished slavery, but let's leave whites in control of the South. And this didn't go over well with a lot of northern whites who felt, we just fought a civil war. There are 500,000 dead American men because of the Civil War, and you want to put the clock back to where we were before the war started with white supremacy entrenched in the South? That's ridiculous. So, what did freedom mean to different people? Well, for blacks, it was a pretty broad definition. The most basic of which was self-ownership. You're no longer a slave, which means no one can tell you where to go, what to do, what to eat, who to marry. You can no longer be beaten or raped simply because your master wants. It's a fairly basic definition of liberty. You now have ownership of your own body, your own actions, your future, etc. The ability to travel. This is revolutionary. You can just walk and go wherever you want. There's no more patrols. There's no more arrests. There's no more punishment. You just go where the hell you want. But it was much broader than that. It wasn't just, leave me alone. I want to do whatever I want. It was also the freedom to develop institutions which would give real power in black communities in the South. For instance, the family. It was integral to have the family free of any external interference. And during slavery, the family was incredibly vulnerable. We talked about the separation of families because of the internal slave trade during the market revolution. But the other autonomous institution which drastically expanded and really became the power base for the Southern black communities were the churches. For the first time, churches could exist without any white chaperones, attendees, because it was simply illegal for blacks to congregate. But now it was completely free. And Southern black church membership exploded as a consequence. It is not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence that the most prominent civil rights leaders of the 20th centuries were all religious men, religious leaders. Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, Malcolm X, and dare I say it, even Al Sharpton, all religious leaders in their community churches. This is part of a long history of the churches being integral in the black community, right from the very beginning, even before the end of the Civil War. Education. Right from the very beginning, it was very clear that in America, literacy, the ability to read newspapers, the Constitution, laws, were critical if you wanted to be a responsible citizen and be aware of the rights you have and what could not be taken away from you. Now, if you remember, there was no real public education in the South up until the Civil War. Public education was more of a northern thing because Southern white plantation owners were not going to be taxed to pay for schools to educate poor whites and certainly not to educate Southern slaves. So the South really had to pick up and catch up with public education. Voting. It's one thing to recognize the contribution of blacks to victory in the Civil War. It's another thing to abolish slavery legally with the 13th Amendment, but giving blacks the right to vote. That was a pill that most whites, even the most radical northern whites, were not ready to swallow in 1865 for a variety of reasons, racism being one of them. But for Southern blacks, voting was really the most basic thing that you needed in order to survive in America. Because if you were not a voter, there was no reason for anybody to pay attention to you. Schools would not be built, hospitals would not be built, roads, railroads through southern cities and towns, civil rights legislation would never be passed. If blacks don't have the right to vote, why would any of these laws be passed? So voting was a demand immediately. Bless you.
Thank you.
And this was the real sticking point: land ownership. For Southern blacks, the notion of being free from slavery was great, obviously. But now what? The only skill these people have is farming, low-skilled farming. But they don't have any land to farm on their own. They don't have any money to buy any land. And they don't want to go working for their former master, even if being paid by him. So then what the hell are they supposed to do? Very early on, there was a very strong belief that freedom means nothing unless it comes with economic independence. That means land. But then the question comes up, well, then who are we going to take it from? How are we going to give these millions of former slaves their own farms? From whom do we take all this land? We can take it from the plantation owners. Well, remember, freeing the slaves was already controversial enough because slaves were technically property. The notion of simply taking someone's land away and then giving it to others, virtually nobody supported this notion. But Southern blacks felt that this was a reasonable entitlement. And for that matter, nowadays, whenever there's any kind of discussion regarding reparations, because of the hundreds of years of slavery and the long-term legacy of slavery on America's current black communities, the conversation always goes back to, we had freedom, but then what? In some cases, generals had made promises generals had actually offered to liberated blacks in their small departments. They had given them 40 acres and a mule in order to be independent. But this kind of model was never spread for the rest of the country because the feeling was, how are we going to do this without simply taking land away from plantation owners? And yes, the argument could be made that these owners were enemies that were beaten. You can do whatever the hell you want. But the American government is nothing if consistent when it comes to the protection of property. Freeing of the slaves, turning them from property into human beings, was the most revolutionary act in the American legal system up until that point. What about Southern whites? What did they think freedom meant? For them, it was basically, well, we're not allowed to have slaves anymore. That's it. What more do you want? That's the end of the story. And these folks were really not ready for what came afterwards. The lands were destroyed. The cotton production was halted at a time when the rest of the world increased their production. So even when cotton production started again, prices were low. They were never going to be as rich as they were before. Now they'd lost their labor force, and they were occupied by the Northern Army, and they were told these former slaves are no longer to be whipped, beaten, controlled, maltreated. So get over it. These folks were not in any way ready to accept anything other that slavery is over. Everything that came after that, racial equality, legal equality, voting rights for blacks, they were completely intolerant. And then you had the Northern whites, the Republicans, the ones in charge. They had their own view of what was supposed to happen in post-war America. For the Republicans, their idea was give Southern blacks the freedom to work wherever they want, keep their wages, and save for the future. Give them equal opportunities, but not free land. This was an attempt at finding a middle ground between giving newly freed blacks everything they wanted and Southern whites who wanted to give nothing. This was the middle ground. Legal and political equality, but no land. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to try and rebuild the South and provide some kind of infrastructure to make the quality of life in the South better. Schooling and education drastically expanded because of the Freedmen's Bureau, established by Northern Republicans. But whatever thought there was to providing freed slaves with enough land, freed black men with enough land to be independent, was thrown out the window from the very beginning. Mostly because of this guy, President Johnson. He was Abraham Lincoln's vice president who became the president after Lincoln was assassinated. Andrew Johnson was a white Southerner from Tennessee who remained loyal to the Union, but he was about as racist as they come. And he had no interest in giving blacks anything more than just no slavery. So what you have in the South is the situation where there's an expanse of education, healthcare improves, but you have this cycle of poverty because they have no land to be independent farmers, and they don't have enough education yet to do anything else but just low-skilled, low-paid farming. So right from the very beginning in the South, you have freedom, but an immediate cycle of economic poverty, which continued generation after generation after generation. The northern black communities that define, in many ways, black America today, Harlem, Detroit, Chicago, these communities exploded because of the migration from the South to the North during World War I, and especially leading up to World War II. Why? Because of the absolute dearth of economic opportunity in the South, as well as the Jim Crow repressive political situation. So, this takes me to this guy, Andrew Johnson and Presidential Reconstruction. So you have these contending views of what freedom should mean for Southern blacks. And then you have this guy. He's the guy in charge. Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865. Johnson becomes president immediately. Johnson and Lincoln could not be any more different. Lincoln came from Illinois, did not have slavery. Lincoln hated slavery even before he acted to legally abolish it. During the Civil War, Lincoln had black leaders in the White House, like Frederick Douglass, and treated them as exact equals. You'll actually read in your essays by Vincent Harding and Stephen Oates that Frederick Douglass, who was no fan of Lincoln at the beginning, even Douglass, by the end of the Civil War, had grown to respect Lincoln for his treatment of Douglass. Andrew Johnson was a different case altogether. He came from a very conservative Southern culture. He was a racist. He had zero belief that blacks should have equal rights in the new America. So then why did he remain loyal to the Union? If he hated blacks so much, like many Southern whites, why did he remain loyal to the Union? He didn't really care about that. Why did he stay loyal to the Union? Because he hated one group of people even more than he did blacks. Southern plantation owners. Johnson grew up dirt poor. And he and his family and his people were mistreated by Southern plantation owners, the elite, who controlled all the good land, who had all the political powers, the connection, who looked down their nose not only at blacks but Southern whites, poor whites. So when these plantation owners seceded from the Union in defense of slavery, Johnson had no reason to follow them. But that basic cultural racism, he had it just like the people that he hated. So when he came to power, he could do whatever he wanted. because Congress was out of session until December. So from April to December, Johnson could initiate policy by presidential order, executive order, and there was nobody in Congress to say anything, good or bad. The schedule for Congress back then was different than now. It was more cockamamie. Whereas now, they're out of session for just a few weeks at a time during summer break, Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc. Back then, they had a longer session. I don't know why, but they were gone, most of them. Now, in this time, Johnson decided to do a bunch of things on his own, which didn't go over well. For instance, he pardoned most Southern whites and said, okay, don't worry, you're never going to be brought to court for being traitors in the Civil War. So go back to what you were doing before. All is forgiven. Which may have made sense for like the privates in the Army, but he was also pardoning members of the Southern Congress, senators, generals, really high up people that should have been brought to trial. He said, no, forget it. He pardoned them all. That already pissed a lot of people off. He then went to the southern states and he said, you need to set up governments. We need provisional governments, state governments, and then you can have elections later. But set up governments. So the people that he just pardoned, that were a few months ago, the enemies of the Union, are now set up as the governors of the southern states. And what kind of governments do they set up? A government of white only, members and voters. So Andrew Johnson, in his few months where he could do whatever he wanted to rebuild the nation, rebuilt a system of white supremacy in the South, which the Civil War had just been fought to eliminate. So that didn't go over very well. The Southern white response to having such a sympathetic president in office, who said, set up governments any way you want, but only whites have power, was to think that they could do whatever they wanted. They could ignore the fact that times had changed. For instance, not only did former Confederate leaders come back to power, but the violence against blacks in the streets went through the roof. Because the belief was, the President of the United States has said that white supremacy is back on the table. So we can do whatever we want. He's not going to come down here and punish us. He's not going to order the army to punish us. Black codes were set up throughout the South. These black codes were meant to regulate the lives of these newly liberated Southern black men and women in a way as if slavery was still around. For instance, the black code said you couldn't testify against whites if you happen to be black. You couldn't serve on juries, couldn't vote, you couldn't serve in the state militias. These were all fairly broad dismissals of basic rights and obligations of citizenship. So how did the North react? The North reacted rather predictably. Johnson and his allies said, okay, the southern state governments and the southern congressmen and senators are all legitimate, even though they're only elected by whites, and even though they reproduce the old Confederate political system. The Republicans, especially when they were starting to come back to Congress, went completely ballistic. Now, you have to remember this about the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. We get used to hearing about the Republican Party as, yeah, they were for ending the Civil War, freeing the slaves. They all agreed, basically, on all the important stuff. But they didn't. They didn't. There were radical Republicans who felt, give the blacks land, education, and the vote right now. You had conservative Republicans who said, no, just abolish slavery, and that's it. And then you had moderate Republicans in the middle. So when they all came back and they faced what President Johnson had done, they had mixed reactions. They were all united on the basic principle that emancipation is a law now. You cannot recreate white supremacy in a secret, coded way. Blacks are now free. White supremacy cannot be reestablished in just a different name. But after that, they pretty much had difficulty agreeing on other stuff. They did agree on the equality of the races before the law. That was easy. But the moderate Republicans didn't want to give blacks the vote. Radical Republicans said the only way blacks in the South will ever be protected is if they have the vote and the government that they elect establishes civil rights and enforces them. The moderate and the conservative Republicans said, forget it, we're not going that far. But at least they agreed on the enforcement of emancipation. That white supremacy had to come to an end. The other disagreements regarded the state-run governments. The radical Republicans couldn't bring themselves to accept any government of the South elected by whites only. To them, it just seemed sacrilegious. How could we possibly have fought a civil war, lost 500,000 men, all that money spent, all that trouble, and then the same people in power before the end of the Civil War, who we beat in a war, are back in power? What the hell was the point? They also wanted to give land to slaves, former slaves, and the moderates disagreed with them. Now, the one thing the moderates and the radicals managed to get together on was to say the Southern congressmen and the Southern senators, we are not going to allow them to sit in the House of Representatives or the Senate. Because here's the thing about the American Constitution, which is not known by many people. The House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, they pretty much decide who they allow to sit in their chambers. So the Constitution says, you know, a senator is elected during this time, he or she runs or serves for 6 years. But the House and the Senate have very clear rules of the basic requirements that you need in order to sit in the House and the Senate. So if they decide, we don't think your election was legitimate, go back home, then that's legal, and they did. They had to allow the southern state governments, because those were outside of their purview, but they refused to seat the southern congressmen and senators. Congress is back in session in 1866, so what do they start doing? They start passing laws. First off, they extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. This bureau, which had done good work, was running out of money, running out of time. So they had to pass a law to refund it, to extend its life. They also passed the Civil Rights Act. They wanted to pass a national law to overwhelm the state laws, the black codes, which had disenfranchised blacks. This was the first civil right. In this country, we have come to accept the 1964 Civil Rights Act was really the first Civil Rights Act in this country. It wasn't. It was just the only one that mattered. America has the distinction of having had 4 or 5 Civil Rights Acts before the big one of 1964, all of which failed. Why? Because there was no enforcement mechanism. If you pass a law that says blacks have equal rights in the South, but there's no punishment for people that don't obey that law, no one's going to obey that law. The 1964 law had punishment. So what happened? The fight's on. Congress has passed laws to make emancipation and some type of racial equality a reality. President Johnson vetoes both laws. He just vetoes them. This is problematic. Because the only thing Johnson had going for him was that his enemies, the Republicans, were divided. Radicals, moderates. When Johnson vetoes these two laws, a weak Civil Rights Act and the very uncontroversial extension of the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, moderates and Republicans say, there's no working with this guy. He is just stubborn and refuses to understand the changing times. So they get together and they override the veto on the Civil Rights Bill. Overriding a presidential veto takes a lot of work and a lot of votes. But the Republicans controlled Congress, and now with the moderates and radicals working together, they overrode the veto and the Civil Rights Bill becomes a law. If you can override a presidential veto, that means you can make laws by yourself. The president can veto it, you just override it because you've got the votes. So Congress now starts making laws. In 1866, they passed the 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in America. The 14th Amendment said unequivocally, if you're born in this country, regardless of race, you're a citizen. And citizenship means equality in the face of the law. End of story. It's a very short amendment. The second part of the amendment says, if any state refuses to uphold this principle, Congress has the right to punish them. Now, why not black voting? If the 14th Amendment says everybody's a citizen who's born in this country, why not just give blacks the right to vote right then and there? Again, the radicals and the moderates were divided. They were willing to go towards the 14th Amendment, but actual voting, they were still divided. Now, Congress approved it. It was sent out to the states in order to be voted on by each state. And this is where it gets interesting. In 1866, when the states each individually had to vote on this constitutional amendment, there was an election going on, a midterm election, specifically to Congress, which is what midterm elections are. The only way to beat the 14th Amendment was to make sure that the requisite majority of states did not approve it. So during the midterm elections, President Andrew Johnson does something that no president had ever done before in the history of the United States. He goes on the road and he campaigns against any candidate that supports the 14th Amendment. No president has ever done this before. It's actually controversial because it seems beneath him to be campaigning like a common low-level politician. What is the result of all this? The Republicans completely swamp their opponents at the ballot box. The Republicans have even more political power, and the radical Republicans specifically. The breach between Johnson and the Republican Party gets larger and larger. Look at these numbers. In the midterm elections, the Republicans in the House of Representatives gains 37 seats. That's 173 total. What the hell does that mean? You only need 146 to override a presidential veto, and the Republicans have 173. In the Senate, the Republicans pick up 18 seats, which back then, considering the size of the Senate, was quite the ass-whipping of the Democrats. But you only need 44 seats to override a presidential veto. So what do you think happens when you've got Congress, which is now ruled by the radical Republicans, and they have a bulletproof majority to override a presidential veto, and the president and Congress hate each other? What do you think is going to be the result in the future when Congress goes up against the president and the president tries to resist and override some of the more liberal laws that Congress is going to pass? Who do you think is going to win? Congress. And so what happens next is the end of presidential Reconstruction and the beginning of congressional or radical Reconstruction. And that's where things are kind of interesting. And that's what you're going to read about this coming Thursday. All right? So, I'm done. I'm done early. Have a good rest of the week.